So today I want to talk a little bit about what I call the cultural singularity. And I suppose this has probably been around to some degree for a while, but it's something I've been thinking about over the last year or so on the speed at which culture is changing. So we're going to take a look at it in kind of three segments. First, I'll say it's all hip-hop's fault. Then we'll talk about exotic blitz schemes. And finally, porn star's career path. And these, the words I hear a lot, or if you're reading a lot in trade publications or blogs and websites about what we do, the advertising marketing industry, or even just about business in general, you hear a lot about complexity, disruption, chaos, everything's moving fast, nobody has any of the answers, and it's all true. And I think the cultural singularity really speaks to that to a great degree. So when we say singularity, there's the kind of traditional idea of that, which is Ray Kurzweil, the futurist, talking about when humans and computers will come together and we'll all be plugged in some sort of William Gibson cyberspace sort of a thing. And when you think about it, we all do have our mobile phones with us almost all the time now, and the digital extension of ourselves is getting pretty close to that sort of a singularity. But I'm talking about something a little bit different. I'm talking about a cultural singularity, and if I were to pinpoint one specific time when everything kind of came together or started to come together, I would say it was in 1986. And I'll explain that in a minute, but first we'll jump back in a time machine 20 years from there, and we'll take a look at 1966. And we'll take a look at your typical ad industry, Mad Men type of executive, and think about what his job was like when he was thinking about his clients and how to do a good job for them. And from a cultural standpoint, he was probably watching 2 or 3 TV stations. He was reading a magazine or 2. He had 1 newspaper probably, saw a couple of movies each year, maybe went to a play, and he was covered with that. He could feel pretty confident that anything that his clients would bring up or anything that the end user, the consumer, would be interested in, he probably had a handle on. Yeah, there was other fringe stuff way out there that was happening, but it would never kind of infiltrate that core center that a Campbell's Soup or Jaguar or Coca-Cola would need to worry about. So let me take you in through music as an example of how things were like before we got to 1986 and that cultural singularity point, all right? So what I would call music trends, BBB, and I'll explain the Bs in a minute, but if you think of it in the 40s and 50s, you had the Perry Comos, Bing Crosbys, Frank Sinatras, those crooners, and then there was a reaction to that, right? So rock and roll was the music of youth, and it was kind of the pendulum swing in the other direction from the crooners. Eventually, rock and roll becomes this bloated, over-the-top arena rock with all these theatrics and the big hair and 5-minute guitar solos about Middle-earth. And ultimately, there was a reaction to that, right? So there comes punk rock. And punk rock says, it's not about musicianship, it's not about the clothes you're wearing, it's just about emotion. And then as we go down to the bottom, when we get into disco, it swings back the other way again. And no, it's not about just that. It is about the production values and how you look and the way you dress and those things. And you see that kind of evolves into the British New Wave. And that's like Flock of Seagulls with the guy's hairs in his face. And the hair bands of the US, and that's about theatricality as well. Then you get to the boy bands, and that's still about production more than music. Until finally you have a swing back in the other direction, and you've got grunge, when once again it's about the music. It's not about dressing a certain, or it is about dressing a certain way, but it's not about dressing in a kind of a high style, right? So you can kind of see, and this isn't obviously exhaustive, but you can see how there are these pendulum swings. And then we get to 1986, which for my money is where things really start to change in an interesting way. And just, in those musical trends, I didn't include hip-hop, which obviously is a huge influence from a cultural standpoint. So this is where we're going to really start to take a look at it. So in 1986, Run DMC partnered with Aerosmith for Walk This Way. And this is a huge moment in cultural and hip-hop history. It really puts hip-hop on the map. Aerosmith, whose career at that point was kind of going nowhere, ends up having another 25-year career because of this kind of weird mashup of rock and hip hop. Pretty big moment. Also in 1986, we have the debut of the Fresh Prince, who goes on to become, one of the biggest movie stars in the world. But from a hip hop standpoint, it's interesting because he's talking about shopping at the mall and his mom and borrowing, the parents' car and these things that suburban kids and suburban parents could understand. So it kind of puts things in a new kind of a weird frame. Hip hop was this weird thing out on the end that you didn't really need to worry about. But now it started being something from a cultural standpoint that was more relatable. Also in 1986, you have the launch of NWA, right? So Run DMC, Fresh Prince, and NWA all in 1986. Now these guys represent a new and incredibly dangerous offshoot of rap, right? This is where the whole gangsta sound comes from, and these are the guys that are going to be the ruin of America. The FBI are like checking them out, and it's really a dangerous thing. And of course, suburban white kids absolutely love it, which is even worse, right? So even though I present to you Run DMC, Fresh Prince, who becomes Will Smith, and NWA, I would argue that none of those are the most important thing that happened in hip-hop in 1986, because you've also got these guys, right? The Beastie Boys come out in 1986. And again, this flips everything we think we knew about hip-hop and how we could kind of marginalize it, right? Because now we've got middle-class Jewish white guys in New York, but they're brash and they're rude, and again, they're dangerous, but they can't be dangerous because they're nice Jewish white guys. So it's this whole kind of weird thing where it's a mix that nobody knows quite what to do with when they first came out, and we all know, and they go on to become kind of like the foundation of a lot of things. But back then in 1986, you guys won't remember, but I remember, they were like really controversial. And then they throw in the producer Rick Rubin, and he brings in this hard rock sound that they kind of mesh with, and everything is just kind of thrown into this weird bouillabaisse of cultural elements coming together. So I want to show you this video. Hopefully we'll get the music or the volume up right. But this is from early 1987, and it's from the Fox network, which at the time was just starting, interestingly enough, right? Another kind of like weird entry into culture. And they have the Joan Rivers show. So they create a kind of traditional late night talk show, but they bring in the exact opposite of Johnny Carson, who was nice and gracious to his guests. And Joan comes in there with a machine gun, right? And she's just mowing down everybody. So watch this clip, and you'll just see like how weird everything was from a cultural standpoint in this 86, 87 time frame.
It's The Late Show, starring Joan Rivers. Joan's guest tonight are Gene Hackman, talk show hostess Sally Jesse Raphael, Mafia Princess Antoinette Giancana, and the Beastie Boys.
All right, let me just pause it right here real quick. So what a weird show, right? They've got Gene Hackman, who's this traditional actor. They've got Sally Jesse Raphael, who's like the pre-Oprah queen of daytime. Antoinette Giancana, the Mafia Princess, this kind of like proto-reality show star. And as the guy's announcing all this, like nothing, right? Then he says, and the Beastie Boys, and everyone goes bananas.
Jesse Raphael? The Beastie Boys? And Antoinette Giancana, the Mafia Princess. So don't... My next guests have previously been referred to as a bunch of loudmouth brats and kids that stomp around the stage like awkward thugs. Well, to me, I just like to think of them as my guys. They're just a bunch of simple kids. Right now, they're here to perform. You gotta fight for your right to party. The Beastie Boys!
There's more to that, and it gets even like more insane, right? So After their performance, they come back and they completely take over the interview. Like they're sitting on her desk. She's now in like the guest seat. And she's like she keeps trying to insult them. And they keep trying to be nice. And it's just the whole thing is totally weird. And just, you could just see like how like everything was coming together and no one quite knew what to do with other parts as culture from all these different directions are smashing and kind of meeting each other for the first time, right? She doesn't know the name of the album. And that seems like hysterical to us now that you wouldn't know License to Ill. But back then they were just so new and out of nowhere. So if you get a chance, like look up Beastie Boys' Joan Rivers show, because the whole interview really is funny. All right, let's continue. Now, obviously, the B was before Beastie Boys, and now we're after Beastie Boys, right? So think about music, in the last, say, 15, 20 years, and you look at Beck or Rage Against the Machine, the Avalanches, who at the time like had more samples in their album than anybody else, or how Janelle Monáe kind of uses 7 different genres in one album. Then you have Girl Talk, who basically just creates albums out of nothing but samples, or even somebody like Psy and kind of where he's coming from. You don't see the pendulum swings anymore, right? There's not like, there's this sound and then there's a reaction to it over here. No, because Beck takes sounds from like 15 different sources, and Rage Against the Machine is hip hop and it's rock and roll together, and you start to lose those sorts of clear distinctions between this sound and this and that sound, or this piece of culture and that piece of culture. And that's where you start to see, as I said, the cultural singularity. Everything coming into the middle, from places you wouldn't have expected, from sources that you didn't even know existed before, were somewhere way out on the fringe, and now, boom, they're on, network TV.